Imagine the American Civil War, a conflict that tore apart a nation and reshaped its future. Now, add a significant twist. What if there was no draft during the Civil War? How would this have changed the course of history? Join us as we explore this intriguing what-if scenario.
First, let's understand why the draft or conscription was introduced during the Civil War. By 1862, both the Union and the Confederacy were grappling with the harsh realities of war. The initial enthusiasm for enlistment had waned, and both sides needed more soldiers to sustain their armies. The Confederacy introduced conscription in April 1862, followed by the Union in March 1863 with the Enrollment Act.
The draft was highly controversial. It led to widespread resistance, violent protests, and even riots, most notably the New York City draft riots in July 1863. For many, the draft symbolized a loss of personal freedom and the harsh intrusion of the government into their lives.
Without the draft, the Civil War would have relied solely on volunteers. Take, for example, Francis Parker, a farmer from Ohio, had always dreamed of a quiet life with his beloved wife Gwendolyn. When the war began, Francis felt a strong sense of duty to fight for the Union. But with no draft to compel him, his decision to join the army was purely voluntary. This left him in a moral dilemma. Would he leave Gwendolyn and their newborn son behind to fight for a cause he believed in, or would he stay to protect his family? Francis ultimately chose to volunteer, inspired by Lincoln's call to preserve the Union and end slavery. His letters to Gwendolyn from the battlefield were filled with longing and love, reflecting the sacrifices made by countless soldiers who fought by choice, not compulsion.
In the South, Samuel Jackson, a young man from Georgia, faced a similar decision. The Southern cause was deeply personal to Samuel, rooted in a desire to defend his homeland from what he saw as Northern aggression. Without a draft, Samuel's enlistment was driven by patriotism and the pressure from his community. Samuel's story highlights a critical aspect of a draftless war: community influence. In small towns across the Confederacy, young men like Samuel would have been compelled by social pressure and a sense of honor to volunteer, creating tight-knit units bound by a shared sense of duty.
The absence of a draft would have profoundly affected both the Union and Confederate war efforts. The Union, with its larger population and industrial base, had an advantage in resources. However, without the draft, the Union would have faced significant challenges in maintaining troop numbers. The war could have seen a greater reliance on older soldiers, immigrants seeking citizenship, and African-American volunteers after the Emancipation Proclamation.
One notable figure in this context would be Frederick Douglass. An ardent abolitionist, Douglass campaigned tirelessly for African-American men to join the Union Army. Without the draft, his efforts would have been even more critical. Douglass's passionate speeches and writings would have galvanized many to enlist, turning the tide of the war.
The Confederacy, with its smaller population and fewer resources, would have struggled even more without conscription. The war effort would have relied heavily on the zeal and dedication of volunteers. This might have led to shorter enlistment periods and a greater turnover of troops, impacting the Confederacy's ability to sustain prolonged campaigns.
Community pressure and a strong sense of Southern identity would have driven many to volunteer. But the question remains, would it have been enough? The South's reliance on slavery also meant that enslaved people, who made up a significant portion of the population, were not available for military service until the very end of the war, when the Confederacy considered arming them as a last resort.
Without the draft, the home front would have looked quite different. In the North, families would have faced the emotional and economic strain of voluntary enlistment. Communities would have rallied to support their soldiers, creating a stronger bond between civilians and the military. Women like Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, would have played even more crucial roles in supporting the war effort, organizing aid societies, and providing medical care.
In the South, the war's impact would have been even more profound. With many men volunteering, the burden of maintaining farms and plantations would have fallen on women, children, and the elderly. The Southern economy, already strained by blockades and shortages, would have suffered further as voluntary enlistment depleted the labor force.
So what might the ultimate outcome have been in a civil war without the draft? Without conscription, both sides might have struggled to maintain adequate troop levels, potentially prolonging the war. A longer conflict could have led to even greater devastation, both on the battlefield and on the home front. Military strategies could have shifted, with a greater emphasis on attracting volunteers through incentives and propaganda. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis would have needed to inspire their citizens continually, emphasizing the moral and patriotic reasons for fighting.
The post-war period, known as Reconstruction, might have also looked different. With a war fought entirely by volunteers, there could have been a stronger sense of unity and shared purpose in the North. In the South, the end of the war might have been met with more resistance, given the deeply personal sacrifices made by volunteers defending their homeland. The Civil War was a defining moment in American history, shaped by countless decisions and events. Imagining a war without the draft offers a glimpse into an alternative reality, highlighting the human stories and the potential for different outcomes.
As we reflect on this scenario, we're reminded of the profound impact of individual choices and the collective spirit that drove both sides in this brutal conflict. Whether through voluntary enlistment or conscription, the soldiers of the Civil War left a legacy that continues to shape the United States to this day.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more what-if scenarios. As always, stay curious and keep dreaming big.